Hi there, and welcome to another interview today. Well, to be honest, one of my dream team. There's two people I've always wanted on since I started doing this. One is Michael Eads, who keeps saying he will do it. That was a year ago. And somebody else said they'd do it. And that was a year ago. And they're finally here. And I will let Amber O'Hearn introduce herself. Hi, Amber.
Hi, thank you, Stephen. I apologize for the long wait. My life just sometimes gets so incredibly busy. You've asked me to introduce myself, and that's always hard because I don't know exactly what the people listening will not know or know about me, but I've been in the carnivore space for probably 15 years. Yeah, since the end of 2008 is when I first discovered the carnivore diet. We weren't even calling it the carnivore diet then. We were calling it zero carb, and I actually was one of, if not the first person to call it that. So it's kind of funny to see how far it's taken off under that name, and it's just a completely different world from when I started, when there were just, really a few dozen or maybe a couple hundred at most people who were trying this crazy thing, and to see, it's on mainstream news. So it's been a long ride, and I've been studying various aspects and trying to figure out what it's all about, because when I started, I had been a low carb dieter and advocate and avid reader for a dozen years already then, but I had no inclination that a diet could be healthy without vegetables. So that really turned my thinking upside down, and it's been quite an interesting ride ever since.
Yeah, you see, you've joined a gang of weirdos that don't eat fruit and veg, those wonderful life-giving health benefit riddled things. Was there a particular health motivation that drove you to carnivore?
It's embarrassing. It was really all about weight. It would be dishonest to say anything else. I've struggled with my weight off and on my entire life. I wasn't obese ever, but I've been highly overweight multiple times. And low carb solved that for me in my 20s, but it was temporary. And so I found myself, so let's see, in 2009, I would have been 37. Uh, Again, close to 200 pounds at 5'6", and already on a low carb diet and not understanding why, and trying to figure out what element in my life I was missing. And I came upon these people doing this zero carb thing, and a lot of them had these background stories that were like mine, in the sense of having stalled out above their ideal weight or just having regained. And when they cut out the vegetables and plants, they were able to lose that weight. And I thought, well, I can do that for a short period. If it helps me, then I can get to my ideal weight, and then I can just maintain again with low carb. But then what happened was that it actually put my depression, my adulthood long, and probably earlier on, if I'm honest, major depressive disorder, re-diagnosed as bipolar type 2. It just completely, at this point, I think I would actually say reversed, but at the very least put into permanent remission, that mood disorder. And so that's when I knew, like, I'm not going to go back to low carb for maintenance, because this is really astonishing, and this is giving me way more benefit than I ever expected.
What do you think it is about fruit and veg that
I
I know that's a
really
big
wish I
question?
knew. I wish I knew. There are different theories about it. One of the prominent ones is that a lot of plants get through the gut and cause intestinal permeability, basically. And that then things that a normal body should be able to have a proper immune response and keep most of that stuff out. Now we've got toxins floating around that maybe even can get past the blood-brain barrier, or causing havoc. So it could be just a toxic load thing. I think that's the best theory of all the ones that I've heard, but I think we're a long way from actually proving it out, because we're not even at a place where it's really acknowledged that it's a thing. It's a fascinating place to be now, because the ketogenic diet itself is getting a lot more acknowledgement for psychiatric conditions, a lot. But for me, I had been on a low carb diet, and my psychiatric conditions may have been improved, but they definitely were still progressing. So the difference between carnivore and ketogenic in terms of getting research done, I think we're still quite a ways out from that.
Yeah, I think, people like Georgia Eade are getting on Diary of a CEO and getting the awareness out there. Frustrates me because I do a success story every week, a video success story, and the mental health benefits, for 5 years now. I don't run out of guests because there's so many people that have changed the way they feel, the way they look, how athletic they are, their body composition, their mood, everything is completely improved. I think the problem is there's so many myths out there. And one of the reasons I really wanted you on is because you were one of the first people to talk about vitamin C. And even now, people still tell me, well, there's no vitamin C in the carnivore diet. When I say people, I mean things like Chat GPT tell me.
Yeah.
And I corrected it only yesterday because I knew you were coming on. And it still said there's no vitamin C in red meat. And I said, well, there is. And it said, oh, I apologize. Yes, you're probably right. So I'd love to hear your story about how you discovered that we were being misled about the fact that red meat had no vitamin C. Would you mind just recounting that?
Well, I was suspicious about it for a couple of reasons. The main one being that the people that I knew and myself were not getting signs of scurvy, and that seemed in and of itself quite strange. I did not think that we were somehow actually manufacturing it, although I think some people think there might be some undiscovered pathway, but I don't think that's not what I was thinking, and it's not what I think now. I think it was actually by accident that I was looking up in the USDA database how much vitamin C there was, because I thought, I don't know, I was looking and I noticed this little footnote about it. And that footnote said, not measured. And I realized that all the meat entries in the whole database that everyone's grabbing from, all the websites are just assuming is a correct measurement, wasn't a measurement at all. It was an assumption. And so then that led me to try to find, more obscure papers where people are saying, like comparing the vitamin content of different muscles and organs of different species in, very obscure scientific publications, at which point I realized that all of the muscles in the animals that we eat have some level of vitamin C. And it's not very much, but if that's the basis of your diet, if all of your calories are coming from meat, that's just going to add up. And it's going to add up to the point where it covers the anti-scurvy, anti-scorbutic dose, which is another issue. And that's that the RDAs are based on not just the amount that you need to not show a deficiency, a frank deficiency, but they have this whole baked in idea that, and I kind of understand where it's coming from. They want to make the RDAs not just be enough so that you don't end up with some terrible disease like rickets or beriberi or scurvy or whatever the case may be, but that it's supporting health so you're not getting chronic diseases. But the problem is that our conception of how chronic diseases work is so skewed and so based on, epidemiology and things that don't really support causal knowledge, that the RDA in the US, I'm not sure what it is in the UK, but for vitamin C is like 10 times as much as you probably actually need, based on metabolic syndrome type diseases. And so we know that if you're on a low carb diet, your risk for metabolic disease, metabolic syndrome is very, very low because it's actually reversing metabolic syndrome. So I don't have any kind of worry about meeting a dose that might help reverse metabolic syndrome if my diet is already doing that. So yeah, I ended up doing a pretty deep dive and writing about the various aspects of vitamin C, not just based on carnivore dieters not getting scurvy and not just based on the RDA having not actually measured it and the RDA being based on the potential for chronic disease. But I also was looking into ways that vitamin C is used in the body and whether some of the things that we're eating might actually lower the need for vitamin C. One piece of evidence that was always really interesting and compelling to me was that we knew from Arctic explorations that fresh meat actually cures scurvy. So it's very famous to talk about limeys and people bringing citrus fruits to get vitamin C to prevent scurvy in those explorations. But what seems to have become less noticed is that this point that it was known that fresh meat would cure it. And it's very curious because if scurvy, the whole name of it is the name of vitamin C is like the anti-scurvy vitamin. If scurvy is caused by lack of vitamin C, then why would this thing that doesn't actually have a very high level of vitamin C, it has some, that was important for me to establish for myself, but it seems odd that it would not only prevent it, but would actually cure it. And so that's why I started looking into whether there was something else in meat that might actually be helping. And the first thing I thought about was to do with collagen, because we know that vitamin C is required for the synthesis of collagen. But from everything that I could tell, when you eat collagen, it has to be broken back down into its constituent amino acids. And the vitamin C step is needed for rebuilding them into the right structure for collagen. And so it seems like it can't possibly spare it to eat it that way if it's being broken down again. But the same is not true for carnitine, which is a very important amino acid, especially for fat metabolism, because it's required to transport fatty acids into the mitochondrion for burning them for energy. And so I started looking into carnitine and found out that carnitine itself gets absorbed fully intact. And so if you don't need vitamin C to synthesize carnitine, there can be a sparing effect there. And it was interesting to find out things, for example, that in the progression of scurvy, long before these, telltale signs like bleeding gums and wounds not healing that are collagen effects start to happen, what first happens is that people get really, really tired. And I think that that's probably a symptom of carnitine deficiency. And so once you get a lot of carnitine in your system, maybe that allows that bit of vitamin C that's there to now start going toward collagen synthesis, and everything starts to come back together.
Yeah, and so it's such a fascinating subject. I mean, I'm quite proud of working through the vitamin C ferroreductase enzyme, where if you're on a plant-based diet or if you're getting your iron from non-heme sources, you need a lot of vitamin C because of that process from the vitamin C.
Right, that's another way it could be sparing. That's true.
Yeah. Yeah, and as we spoke before, I pressed record, because we have the red blood cells possibly living longer, and therefore we're not getting the hemoglobin, the heme coming back in. The whole iron debate about iron overload is pretty fascinating. I really wanted to zero in on the vitamin C because it is a myth. It still comes up. Every meeting, every week, I have a community meeting and people, where am I going to get my vitamin C? And I say, well, look, actually, when you look at our needs, just the mere fact that we don't need it so much because we're not converting non-heme Fe3 plus to Fe2 plus, we don't need it to do that. Right. So 70% of the standard, Western diet is carbohydrate based, and that's where everyone's getting their iron from. They're not getting it from meat, really. There's a lot of non-heme iron being turned over, so you need a lot of vitamin C. And like you say,
that's true. And I'm interested in what you just brought up about the iron overload idea. I have not done a lot of study into iron overload, but it's definitely one of those topics that can come up when people are worried about or criticizing the idea of a carnivore diet. They say, well, you can't be eating that much meat because it's going to cause iron overload. What I've known, what I've learned about it so far, and again, I haven't looked very deeply into it and it's been a while, but it seems to me that there are mechanisms for absorption, including hepcidin, for example, that regulate how much iron you're taking in, such that it's not really just mere exposure of iron to the intestinal wall that is going to cause that to develop. And I've also noticed that iron overload seems to be, in some ways, a symptom or a causal effect caused by metabolic syndrome downstream somehow. And I'm wondering if in the absence of metabolic syndrome, it just doesn't become a problem in the same way. So I'd really be fascinated to hear what you've learned.
Well, you're the guest, but I mean, yes, mucosal ferritin is very underestimated because, there's all this stuff about you have to do therapeutic phlebotomy to rid yourself of iron. And yet we got this beautiful system where we rid ourselves of iron every single day as we shed the mucosal lining of our gut, which is happening in its entirety over 3 to 4 days. So when you're carnivore, one of the things that happens is you seem to see this improvement in gut health. You also get more mucosal ferritin shedding. That actually happens. So you're losing more iron that way. There's more regulation there. And also, as I mentioned about the red blood cell life, because of the hemoglobin and the recycling. So you lose about a third every single minute of what you were getting before. You will see increases in ferritin because the body is pretty smart and it will see that the heme's not coming in from the hemoglobin, which is not a bad thing. The problem is, I suppose, everything is based on 45 to 65% carbohydrate intake, all the normative ranges.
Right.
So if you're using the wrong metric in the first place to try and guide you, you're going to go wrong. If I wanted to improve my 100-meter sprinting time, I'd be an idiot to use Usain Bolt's average speeds because I would continually be wrong and think there's something wrong with me. But if I look at other 60-year-old males who haven't run 100 meters before, and I looked at their stats, that would actually give me a better idea of how do I need to improve, or actually, am I doing okay? So normative ranges, firstly, just completely muddy the waters. So we have to go back to what's the common sense and what's the joined up thinking. So when we do bloods, for instance, and I always insist on a full iron panel, because when you look at transferrin and transferrin saturation, total iron binding capacity, serum iron, there isn't any proof of iron overload at all, even with higher ferritin. So it's very misguided. And I think it's because we're using the wrong ranges. It's all well and good saying, well, you're short on vitamin C, like we were just talking about, when it's not factoring, you need less. I mean, to me, that's a no-brainer. That is an absolutely no-brainer. Almost to the point of, the other thing that frustrates me is because, I did a lot with diabetes for a long, long time, is trying to stop your blood glucose spiking. It's so obvious. Stop eating the thing that makes it spike. That's it, So, yeah, I don't want it to be about me, Anne, because I've only got you for 30 minutes. I want your opinions.
Well, that's okay. This is a wonderful exchange, and we're singing the same song about those blood ranges. It's really important to me, and I'm really happy to see you talk about it.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing. If I was a bigger influencer and I had more data, then we could do stuff. Obviously speaking to other people, because I mean, in 10 years, I got 1,000 clients, but that's not enough data really, but it gives me a good idea. I mean, it took me a while to go public with everything, but I wanted to be sure that I was onto something. And when you've got lots of blood from carnivores and lots of blood from keto dieters, and also the 5 years I did with high carb, I can see the huge differences in outcomes. I mean, in the end, it's all about symptoms and how the person presents. And that's one of the things I definitely find. I can have somebody send me bloods and they are literally perfect, in inverted commas. They are great. And I say, how do you feel? And they say, awful. And I can also have people where they're all over the place, subclinical thyroid and this, that, and the other. And I say, how do you feel? And they're like, absolutely perfect. So I know the ranges are wrong. Yeah. I did a really interesting thing with, actually two people, a male and a female. It was nice to get both on thyroid, and they were both allegedly subclinical with their TSH, and it was a big problem, even though their T3 production was fantastic and they had no symptoms. So I will use that guy as one example. He said, my doctor keeps saying I've got subclinical TSH, I've got to do something. And I said, well, let's do a thought experiment. Let's say you were the first person ever to have bloods. All right, and we sort of knew what level of T3 you needed and what you needed for T4 and what health outcomes we needed, okay? And we got 4 years of TSH here, allegedly subclinical, but we got perfect T3, perfect T4 in the ranges, and we've got perfect outcomes. If you were the first person, I would assume that your TSH was perfect. I'd have to, because the result from that level of TSH is giving us what TSH is supposed to do, the right level of T4, right level of T3, right conversion, and giving you the metabolic outcomes that you want.
Yeah.
And he was like, well, I never thought of it like that. And I said, but I do think we should, because you're not the only one. And then the lady actually, she had also TPO and TG antibodies. So we could look at profiles, and I did a graph of over 5 years. And what was much more important was ratios, much more important than absolute numbers, especially when it came to T4 to T3 conversion, and the proportion of TSH in relation to those two things. So we could see this pattern. Basically, I'd obviously put everything in the same order year in, year out. And we saw this pattern, and we saw everything as the antibodies reduced, all the other numbers sort of reduced, but the shape was always the same. So when she first started, when she was told there might be a thyroid problem, she didn't have any thyroid problems, as in symptoms. She had thyroid problems with the numbers.
All right.
When she went carnivore, it just improved and improved. And then when you get into as I've spoken about, because there's less demand of moving pyruvate into the mitochondrial, across the mitochondrial membrane, because we're not doing so much glycolysis, you don't need so much T3. So many people say, my doctor's said my T3 is tanked. No, it's an appropriate level for the way you're eating.
Exactly. I really like that idea of imagining that you're the first person, in particular because with the keto and carnivore diet, in a sense, we are the first people. We have to be the set of data for this novel, at least novel in the sense of modern medical history, metabolic situation. I think a lot of people don't really understand the degree to which the metabolic context of a ketogenic diet of any form is just so different biochemically, and how the many diverse effects that can have, and how really important it is to take that into account when you're looking at any kind of numbers. And the gut biome as well. People to get these like profiles of what different organisms are active in their biome, and people get upset because they might have some kind of predominant species that would look like it was an unhealthy situation in a high carb dieter, but it might be completely appropriate in a low carb or a low plant diet.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things I do say to people about, they'll say to me, well, we're all the same, we all work the same. And yeah, that's true. If a surgeon opens you up, they've never met you, they're not going to open you up and go, well, how does this one work? That's true. But what you input is different, and therefore your physiological response is going to be different. And if you've done that for 30 years, let's just say you've lived on carrots, and nothing else, you're going to have a very different response to someone that's lived on salmon all their life. To me, that seems really quite obvious. Anyway.
Yeah. But I think it's even deeper than that because of the metabolic biphasic situation. It's not...
Carry on.
Yeah. Well, I think people often in the past have said things like diets don't work, especially in the context of some kind of disease state. And I think if you put ketogenic diets aside, and suppose we had no knowledge of them, and someone were to say, oh, if you eat, a little more green beans, your arthritis is going to go away. That's bullshit, right?
Mm.
It's just not enough of a change. The nutrients that are going to come from those green beans are going to be similar enough to the nutrients you get in some other pattern of eating under that high carb basic sort of formulation of a diet. But so if someone says, change your diet and it's going to put your autoimmune disease into remission, or it's going to cure your cancer, your alarm bells should go off. That doesn't make any sense. But once you've opened up the completely different metabolic state of a ketogenic diet, all bets are off. It's going to be different. And even one of the first things that we knew about it, that it could put seizures into remission. Seizures are a major, incredible, it's not something where you think, oh, maybe it had a little effect. It's a really major effect that you can't deny. Once you're seeing things like that, then you start to realize this is a completely different animal, not exactly in the surgical sense, but really in a body sense.
No, absolutely. Once the changes happen, it has downstream effects, doesn't it, on everything? Absolutely everything. Right. That's good. Now, I wanted to ask you about something else that you're pretty famous for, which is calling yourself a lipovore rather than a carnivore. So if you could expand on that would be fantastic.
Yeah, I stole that word from Andrew Durache, who's a polar bear scientist. I thought about the term, just like putting it together morphologically and how it should be, but I wanted to see if anybody else had used that. And it definitely pre-exists as a description of polar bears, although polar bears do get a lot of their metabolic needs met from fat in the diet, but I would still classify them as more carnivorous than people. It's a little confusing because whenever you name a species, carnivore, herbivore, frugivore, whatever kind of vor it's going to be, because um, a lot of the time we get that idea based on looking at their behavior. So if you took a fruit bat and you watched it in the wild, you could say, okay, it's a frugivore. But if you had a fruit bat in some weird transported lab and the only thing you had to feed that animal was a bunch of meat, you might look at it and say, well, of course it's a carnivore, but it
Yeah.
might not be in its natural habitat. So that can get confusing, especially when it comes to animals that have the ability to get nutrition from various sources. I think it's fair to say that humans are extremely flexible and adaptable in where they get their nutrients from. And that makes it really tempting to call us omnivores. But I try to reserve that word for a species that really has the physiology to depend much more on either way of eating without a big compromise. And I don't think humans have that anymore. We've lost most of our ability to eat a high fiber diet. We don't have the big guts that we used to have. And we're really quite reliant on some source of animal foods to develop properly. So with that knowledge, with the knowledge that an animal like, for example, a deer can be found eating off of a carcass sometimes to get certain nutrients, and we don't want to call a deer an omnivore. And likewise, a cat can be fed on kibble and live out a fairly normal life, and we don't want to call a cat an omnivore because a cat is like the standard most carnivorous kind of animal that we know. So I wanted to separate it from behavior, and from that, I decided that humans really should be considered facultative carnivores. But I wanted to take it a step further because in our evolutionary trajectory, it appears to me that we spend a lot of time eating almost exclusively meat, but not in a way that would match what we imagine when we think of, say, a lion, because a dog or cat species can get a lot of energy from protein. They have a very high ceiling of intake of protein before it becomes toxic to them, whereas humans can really only go up to around 35% of calories, maybe a little more in some situations, without it starting to have bad physiological effects. And if we're eating a maximum of, let's be super generous, let's say a maximum of 40% of our calories from protein and very, very little carbohydrate most of the year, where's the rest of our food coming from? It's got to be fat. And if fat is the majority of our calories, then that's what we are. We are lipovores. And so I kind of went in that direction, thinking about humans and their fat intake. And I was very influenced by, for example, Stephen Cunnane, who has written a whole book about babies being fat. It's called Survival of the Fattest, in which he talks about how human babies are ridiculously fat, like even compared to species we think of as super fat, like seals, and how that is an adaptation to make sure that our enormous brains are getting the energy that they need, especially during those critical times of development where if there was any kind of food shortage or something, the baby didn't have the ability to keep developing the brain, which is our most important adaptation, we wouldn't have been able to become the species that we are. And so that fatness as an infant was really, really important for us as a species and for our brains to make us who we are. And then I sort of extended that by realizing that we're not just fat as infants. I mean, to us, infants look really fat because they're fat compared to adults. But when you look at adult humans and compare them to other primates that are our closest relatives, our human adults, even the ones that you would look at and say, wow, that guy's super lean, is still like 3 times as fat as a gorilla. So humans are fat in order to support the metabolism to keep our brains running, even when we're on high carb diets. This physiology is unmistakable. And so that's why I've said lipivores. Some people confuse it. I sometimes advocate for very high fat carnivorous diets because I've seen some people will eat a carnivore diet, just, they get rid of the plants and eat a fairly fatty piece of meat for all of their meals, and they immediately feel much better, and that's all they need. But some people, especially some recovering diabetics, really require more of a restriction on the protein side. And if you're eating less protein, you're going to need to eat more fat unless you want to be chronically in starvation. So there is this very high fat version of a carnivore diet that I like to call, well, it started as a joke. I like to call it keto AF because it's a ketogenic animal food diet, but it kind of stuck. And so when I advocate for humans being lipivores, some people think that I mean that humans need to be and have always been on this very high end fat part of the spectrum. And while I do think it's very healthy for a lot of people, I want to emphasize that even if you're only eating 60% fat, that still counts as lipivore in my book.
Yeah, it's so important, actually, essential fats. And in fact, when I have people that have been 30 years on a low-fat diet, which is what I did, especially females, the thyroid is completely tanked, and there's so many awful things. Right, I want to go into a little bit deeper area with you, but it's something that I'm very interested in. So urate oxidase, the enzyme that I think you're interested in.
For breaking down uric acid?
Yeah.
Yeah, I am. And most people don't ask me about that. So that was a nice surprise. Thank you. Yeah, I'm really fascinated with the fact that we don't have uricase, and some people think that this is some kind of accident, that uric acid must be bad for us, and that it's kind of a shame that we have this accident. The pattern of gene
selection.
Yes, the patterns of genes that we find that humans have that prevent uricase from being produced is so systematic and layered that it's really impossible. There just have been so many stops on it that it doesn't seem at all plausible that this could have been just a little accident, And it's not like, something like an MTHFR variant where half of the population has this and half of the population has this. No, it's very highly selected for. And I think that I looked at various ideas that people have, hypotheses for why uric acid might be beneficial. And there are some compelling ones, like actually the one that I think is most compelling, even though it's hardly ever talked about anymore, is the intelligence hypothesis, because uric acid, it operates very similarly to caffeine and xanthines, which have cognitive enhancing abilities. They're nootropics, basically. And so if we were able to keep higher uric acid, then that's an obvious intelligence kind of boost. But it's also an antioxidant. And another thing that I noticed when I was thinking about it a lot was that we often talk about how on a low carb diet, when you start becoming ketogenic, your uric acid will go up temporarily, usually, but temporarily for like a month or more, while your kidneys adapt to the fact that there's competitive excretion for ketone bodies versus uric acid. And it occurred to me that that could actually be a benefit, because if you have high uric acid, that means that you are more likely to retain ketone bodies early, when you're early in that mild keto adaptation process, such that you will de facto be more ketogenic because of that competition for excretion. And so I don't know, maybe it's a bit fanciful, but I did have this idea that high uric acid levels could increase ketosis, basically, especially when you're in the early stages of adaptation, and that could be beneficial for a species as well.
Yeah, I mean, uric acid is something that I do discuss, and I'm not overly worried about high levels of uric acid. And that I'm going back to the bloods and doing rehab. I do have a couple of other specialisms, and I used to do spinal manipulation and advanced medical acupuncture. So I was interested in people with gout and joint pain and doing their bloods. And many people who would come in not for rehab would have very high levels of uric acid, absolutely zero joint pain, and other people would come in with very, very, very low uric acid and major joint pain. So I didn't see it as there was any connection whatsoever. And interestingly, when I was at MeatRx working with Sean Baker, he actually said the same thing. He was a guy that was actually chopping people's, legs and joints off, actually.
Yeah.
I
Gout's
really,
interesting, and it's very sad because I think, from what I understand, once you have some gout crystals or uric acid crystals deposited in joints, if you don't get them all out, then they're very susceptible to recollecting. Like, the process of a crystal creating more crystals is very difficult to stop. So once you have had gout, you're way more susceptible to getting gout over and over again. And even if the level of uric acid doesn't correspond very well with whether you have gout, changes in the level of uric acid can create these spontaneous relapses of it, which is really, really frustrating.
yeah,
But
I mean,
I think the etiology has got to be something completely different, because, like, there are bird species that have really high uric acid, for example. They don't have gout. And things like vitamin A and fructose can actually make the problem worse, regardless of what else you're doing with uric acid.
yeah, and I think that aggregation of crystals, I mean, that's also temperature dependent as well. So the
Fruit.
solubility, for instance, yeah, which is why people say the cold weather, I'm going to be having some joint pain. Well, no, well, yes, but do you want to know why that is? It's a bit geeky, but when you explain it to people, yeah, that makes sense. So I'd do a little drawing about how the less soluble with temperature. And anyway, right. I don't want to talk about me, but you see, this
No,
is
that's
why I'm a fan
cool.
of yours, because you talk
We
about
have
stuff that I like.
we have a lot
Um,
of common interests.
yes, maybe you'll come back on actually.
Sounds
I'm
fun.
not one of those that wants to do a 2-hour interview, so I'm a consumer. And if someone's done 2 hours, whoever they are, I don't really want to do it.
Yeah.
But if it's crazy, isn't it? If there's two videos that are both an hour, I'll probably watch them. Crazy. Right? It's all about perception. I just wanted to just ask you one other thing before you go, which is about PUFAs and short chain fatty acids and the production of ketones, because I think that is something you've talked about before.
Yeah, a bit. This also is something I learned from Cunane originally, is that the more unsaturated a fatty acid is, the more ketogenic it will be, which seems a little bit hard to integrate with other information at times, because in a lot of cases we want to be more ketogenic, and yet there are some reasons to believe that we might want to avoid intake or high intake of polyunsaturated fatty acids. So that leaves you with, like, wondering what is the best thing to do. One point that it's even throws another little wrench into the mix is that a lot of the things that we think of as polyunsaturated fatty acids are the highly unsaturated fatty acids, which are, rather than, so you have, like, you might consider it a kind of base form. We have linoleic acid and linolenic acid, the omega-6 and the omega-3 version. And if you eat those, they're considered essential, but really why they're considered essential, I think, is mostly because of the downstream products when you elongate or saturate, or not saturate, but I can't think of the other process that happens to them. But when these fatty acids are converted into other forms of omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids, then we get, like, arachidonic acid and DHA, which are really useful in terms of structure, because they're used extensively in the brain, and in, like, arachidonic acid is in, I think, every cell. It's really important for muscle cells. It has all kinds of different functions in the body. And so consuming those, if you say, oh, I have a diet that's really high in DHA, that's a very different kind of diet than if you have a diet that's very high in linoleic acid. they're both, if they get metabolized, and polyunsaturated fatty acids do tend to be preferentially metabolized, then it is going to increase your level of ketosis, but they're not really the same at all from a dietary perspective or what kind of outcome you're going to have.
I think it's just such a fascinating subject, to be honest, because the jury's out on so many things that we're talking about. And I don't want to get too deep because I just wanted people to get to know you. And, if you'd like to come back, I'd love to have you back because we can get some comments and then I'll just sort of like soak up those questions and fire them at you if you don't mind. Would you be up for that?
I would love to, and I promise you it won't take a year this time.
Excellent. Okay, so Amber, if people wanted to find out more about you, follow your work or whatever, what's the best way to find you?
Well, I am often very active on Twitter. My handle there is Keto Carnivore, which I've had for a very long time, before I knew that it was going to be a really popular topic. And I'm generally very open to answering questions there to the best of my ability, so you can interact with me there. But most of my writing is on my blog, which is at mostly-fat.com. And I've been writing for a long time, and I think there are a lot of articles that people would be surprised and learn from if they delved into it. Yeah, I wish that more people knew about the things that I was writing, because I do try to get into topics that are on the edges where, not a lot of people are talking about it, and try to get conversations going about the edges of our knowledge on all these things.
Well, that's how I got to know you on the
thank you.
platform, as it's now called, and also from your blog and seeing you being interviewed. So I'm really, really, really proud that I was able to get you on, and I just want to thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. It's been a delightful conversation.